Sudan, a land older than history, where the Blue Nile and White Nile meet, where ancient kingdoms once rivaled Egypt in power and sophistication. A country of over 40 million people, enormous in geography, enormous in potential. And yet, for more than a century, Sudan has been bled dry, not by nature, not by fate, but by men who held power and chose violence. This is the story of those men. This is the story of the Butchers of Sudan. To understand what Sudan is today, you must first understand what was done to it. In 1898, British General Horatio Kitchener led an Anglo-Egyptian army into Sudan and crushed the Mahdist state at the Battle of Omdurman. The Mahdi's followers had ruled Sudan for over a decade, uniting many of its peoples under a common religious and political identity. Kitchener destroyed that. Tens of thousands of Sudanese were killed. The Mahdi's tomb was demolished. His remains were desecrated. What followed was the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, a joint British and Egyptian rule that was, in practice, almost entirely British. Sudan was governed not as a single country with a unified future, but as a collection of fragmented territories to be managed separately. The Arab-Muslim North was developed. Schools, infrastructure, administrative posts. The African and Christian South was deliberately kept isolated, cut off, underdeveloped. This was not an accident. It was policy. The British were preparing to leave one day, and they left behind a country whose regions did not know each other, whose peoples had no shared political language, and whose borders enclosed dozens of ethnic groups with competing histories. In 1956, Sudan became independent. But independence does not erase a wound. It simply transfers ownership of it. Sudan's democratic experiment lasted barely 2 years. In 1958, General Ibrahim Aboud seized power in a military coup, the first of many. Sudan would spend most of the following decades not under elected governments, but under generals. Coups, counter-coups, brief democratic interludes, and then more coups. The most significant of these military rulers was Jafar Nimeiry, who came to power in 1969. Nimeiry was a pragmatist. He made peace with the South in 1972, briefly ending Sudan's first civil war. But that peace collapsed. By 1983, Nimeiry had radicalized, imposed Islamic law across the entire country, including the non-Muslim South, and reignited a war that would kill 2 million people. The southern Sudanese had been fighting for autonomy since before independence. They were African, largely Christian, and animist, and they had been systematically excluded from power in Khartoum. The war they fought was a war for survival. Nimeiry was eventually overthrown in 1985. A brief democratic period followed, but Sudan's tragedy was already locked in a pattern. Whoever took power in Khartoum would use violence to maintain it. That pattern was about to find its most ruthless expression yet. On the 30th of June, 1989, Omar al-Bashir led a coup against Sudan's democratically elected government. He was a military officer, disciplined, methodical, and politically shrewd. Behind him stood Hassan al-Turabi, one of the most powerful Islamist thinkers in the Arab world, who saw in Bashir the vehicle for an Islamic state. The two formed a partnership. Bashir provided the guns, Turabi provided the ideology. What followed was a decade of systematic terror. The regime established ghost houses, secret detention centers where political opponents were tortured, often for nothing more than their beliefs or their ethnicity. The press was shuttered. Trade unions were banned. Democratic institutions were dismantled one by one. Sudan under Bashir became a state sponsor of terrorism. Osama bin Laden lived in Khartoum in the early 1990s, given safe harbor by the regime. Sudan's intelligence services trained and harbored militant groups across the region. And in the south, the war continued, now prosecuted with new brutality. Government-backed Arab militias raided southern villages, killing men and enslaving women and children. Famine was used as a weapon. Aid was blocked. Towns were bombed from the air. By the time a peace agreement was finally signed in 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, Southern Sudan had lost 2 million people. It would eventually vote to become its own country in 2011. Sudan had fractured, but Bashir's worst crime was still unfolding in a region the world was only beginning to notice. In 2003, rebel movements in the western region of Darfur took up arms against Khartoum, demanding political rights and an end to the marginalization of their communities. Bashir's response was catastrophic in its scale and deliberate in its design. The regime unleashed the Janjaweed, Arab militias on horseback and camel, to destroy the non-Arab African communities of Darfur. Villages were burned to the ground. Wells were poisoned. Women were raped as a systematic weapon of war. Entire ethnic groups, the Fur, the Masalit, the Zagawa, were targeted for destruction. The United States government called it genocide. The International Criminal Court agreed. In 2009 and 2010, the ICC issued arrest warrants for Omar al-Bashir, the first sitting head of state ever indicted for genocide. He never stood trial. He continued to rule. By the end of the Darfur conflict's most intense phase, estimates suggest between 200,000 and 400,000 people had been killed and nearly 3 million displaced. Omar al-Bashir had built his power on blood, and the machinery he built to protect himself, including a paramilitary force that would later become the Rapid Support Forces, would eventually outlive him. In December 2018, Sudan erupted. Ordinary Sudanese, students, doctors, engineers, women carrying flags, poured into the streets. The protests spread from city to city. The cry was simple: enough. Enough of Bashir. Enough of corruption. Enough of war. In April 2019, the military removed Bashir from power. He was arrested. The people celebrated in the streets. But 2 men stepped into the vacuum, and both came with blood already on their hands. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a career military officer, head of the Sudanese armed forces. Quiet, institutional, deadly in his patience. And Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, commander of the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary successor to the very Janjaweed that had carried out the Darfur Genocide. Hemedti had built enormous wealth through gold mines and mercenary operations across Africa. He was powerful, ambitious, and answerable to no one. Together, they crushed the revolution they claimed to be protecting. In June 2019, RSF forces massacred over 100 peaceful protesters sitting outside army headquarters. Bodies were thrown in the Nile. Women were assaulted. The world condemned it. Nothing changed. For a brief period, a fragile power-sharing deal with civilian leaders gave Sudan a sliver of hope. Then, in October 2021, Burhan and Hemedti staged a second coup, dissolving the transitional government entirely. And then they turned on each other. On the 15th of April, 2023, war broke out in Khartoum. Two men who had ruled Sudan together, who had crushed the same revolution, signed the same decrees, now sent their forces against each other in the streets of the capital. Hemedti's rapid support forces seized neighborhoods across Khartoum, using civilian homes as firing positions. Hospitals were attacked. Aid workers were killed. The RSF committed mass rape and ethnic massacres in Darfur again, particularly targeting the Masalit people in El Geneina. Burhan's army responded with aerial bombardment, dropping bombs on populated neighborhoods, on markets, on homes. The result has been one of the worst humanitarian crises on Earth. As of 2024, more than 8 million people have been internally displaced, the largest displacement crisis in the world. Famine has been declared in parts of Sudan. Millions face starvation. Khartoum, a city of millions, has been largely emptied and destroyed. What took decades to build has been reduced to rubble in months. The world has largely looked away. Sudan did not fail on its own. It was taken apart, systematically, deliberately, by men who chose power over people again and again and again, by colonizers who planted the seeds of division, by generals who fed on those divisions for decades, by leaders who looked the world in the eye and committed genocide while sitting heads of state. The Sudanese people, who marched in white, who chanted for bread and freedom, who buried their dead and marched again, deserve better than to be footnotes in the ambitions of armed men. The war continues, the crisis deepens, and most of the world does not even know Sudan is burning. Now you do.